Fantastic. Do sit down on the side. I'm going to remain standing because every inch counts. So, 5'4", you've got to take your wins as they come. So the first thing to say is welcome to the last debate before exams and the fourth debate of Easter term. You, of course, all know that the motion is this House believes that Scotland should be an independent country, which is, I'm reliably informed, the actual wording of the question on the referendum, without the this House believes, obviously. So, you all know what the debate's about, so there's no need for a thematic introduction. The only thing that I need to point out is that Gail Lithgow, who would be the third speaker on proposition, is not in fact engaging in cross-dressing as a tribute to Conchita Wurst. That was a joke. But is rather CALLUM Worsley, who stepped in at the very last minute because Gail unfortunately wasn't able to make it. So I think I called him up when he was in the middle of a dissection, as he's a medical student, and he very gallantly decided to go ahead and speak with little more than 2 hours' notice. So special thank you to CALLUM. So in terms of the rules of the debate, although I'm sure the majority of you are familiar with them, the debate will be structured around the 6 main speeches, which will go in the order proposition, opposition, proposition, opposition, proposition, opposition. There will be 2 sets of opportunities for you to have your say. The first is in the floor speeches, which you'll be encouraged to make between the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th speeches in the debate. So these are opportunities for you to make a point in support of any point of view that's obviously relevant to the motion that you choose. So a floor speech is approximately 1 minute in length, and I'll ask for them in proposition of the motion, in opposition to the motion, and in abstention of the motion. And if you could just put your hand up to indicate you'd like to speak and wait for a microphone to reach you. And when the microphone does reach you, please could you state your name and college. These debates are recorded for posterity, and posterity is very demanding and likes to know who's speaking. So if you could enunciate very clearly your name, I'm sure everyone will be very happy. The other opportunity for you to have your say is in the main speeches through points of information. So the main speech will be approximately 10 minutes in length, and in the middle 8 minutes of that, so that is after the end of the 1st minute and before the beginning of the 10th minute, you're able to make points of information, which are short, approximately 15-second interjections. A point of information can be a question, it can be a statement of fact, it can be a wail of protest, although obviously that's probably not preferable. You should introduce your point of information by standing up and saying point of information, or on that point, or if you're feeling particularly pompous, sir or madam. But again, preferable not. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything that you need to be aware of. The debate should last approximately 90 minutes. If it lasts longer than that, it's because of great enthusiasm from the speakers and possibly the floor speakers. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to pass the floor over to Michael Gray. Michael is a staff researcher at Business for Scotland, a pro-independence business and economic policy think tank. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to speak here tonight in Cambridge about Scotland's future. And I think it's especially pertinent to do so in Cambridge because I think this question isn't just about Scotland's future, but about England's future too. I believe, from my politics, that Scottish independence is the greatest opportunity to improve our democracy for a generation. And I say "our" as a reference to the whole House. And I'm going to set out the case for that in 4 distinct areas. First of all, some of the context of how Scotland got here. Secondly, why Scotland would be better off economically with independence. Thirdly, why Scottish independence is now the best opportunity for reform within the British and Irish Isles. And finally, why that vote for independence, your vote tonight through that iLobby, will be good for England too. But I'll start with the context. This debate is about governance. It's about who is best placed to make decisions about Scotland's future. Governments elected at Westminster or governments elected by the people of Scotland. It's about democracy, it's about social justice, it's about prosperity, and it's about Scotland's place in the world. That is the positive case that's been articulated by the Yes campaign and by independence supporters for the past few years. Now, often this has been misrepresented. It's not about identity. You can be British, you can be Indian, you can be Irish and support Scottish independence. It's not about any single political party. And it's not about barriers or borders. It's not about leaving or moving away from any friendship or neighbourly relationship with the people nearby. It's about fomenting a new and better and equal relationship with the countries next to Scotland. And it's really important to keep that in mind during the debate tonight. So those are some of the principles at stake. But it's also important to remember the changes that have taken place at an astonishingly increasing rate within Scotland in recent years. Now, Scotland has always been independent in terms of its law, its church, and its education. But until I was 7 years old, it never had a parliament. And since that year in 1999, things have changed tremendously. In 2007, the CALLUM Commission was born, where all parties across the spectrum, from the unionist perspective, said that Scotland needed more powers. And in 2012, once again, in response to the SNP government, all the unionist parties came together again and said Scotland needed even more powers. And now, in the lead up to independence, all the parties on the other side say, well, even then, in the future, we see Scotland becoming more autonomous and having more control over its own affairs. So the simple fact is that in a decade, Scotland has been transformed. It's changed forever. Scotland is now a nation with self-confidence and self-government in its horizon, or on its horizon. And it's important to remember that, because whether you're on the opposition or proposition side tonight, no one is articulating or supporting the status quo. The status quo is dead, and people in Scotland aren't in support of it. So that's why things are changing. And it's what's led to the campaign, the movement for Scottish independence, which transcends any one government or one individual. The Green Party in Scotland supports independence. There are a vast group of Labour members in Labour for Independence that are campaigning for an independent Scotland. There are Conservative voters in a group called Wealthy Nation from a centre-right, responsibility, fiscal Conservative perspective, who say it's better for Scotland to have responsibility over its own affairs. There are autonomous campaign groups representing Women for Independence, Business for Scotland, National Collective, with thousands of members from autonomous non-party perspectives who all think it's better for Scotland to become an independent nation. So there's a new democratic wave that I think Westminster politicians have not only failed to respond to, but often even failed to recognise. And I hope that they do tonight. But in summary, Scotland will vote yes because these principles are positive, because change is coming and there's great momentum behind it, and because this campaign that has been built in the last 2 years is strongly in support of independence, not for any narrow political ends or for one perspective of a government, but because the people of Scotland are campaigning and supporting Scottish independence. But point 2 is to look at the facts and the figures, the economics. Scotland has a rich economy. If you look at construction, where there's 21 billion, the tourism sector for 11.6 billion, or construction with 39 billion, it's key that Scotland's a wealthy country. Scotland has 5 universities in the world's top 200, with incredible research and development skills. It has a flourishing cultural sector, which is world-renowned, and it has vast energy, fishing and agricultural resources. So the economic case has to be based upon that strong foundation that Scotland has what it takes to be a wealthy, successful, independent country.
Point of information?
Maybe after this next point, because I want to compare both sides of the balance sheet first of all, because if you look at the last 5 years through the government expenditure and revenue Scotland figures, Scotland would have been £8.3 billion better off as an independent country relative to its position in the UK. So not only is Scotland wealthy, but it would have been relatively better off over the last 5 years as an independent country, and I'm happy to take your point now.
Scottish Government has run a deficit for the last 20 of 21 years, and that is including they've had more control over their own finances. So how can we believe they'd be any better after independence?
Absolutely. There have been deficits in most Western countries, especially after the recession. There are very few countries in Europe that run a surplus, apart from oil and renewables-rich Norway, which has had control over its own finances. My argument here isn't that it will be easy. My argument is that Scotland has what it takes and would be able to make the most of more opportunities with the full powers of independence. If anything, a weak fiscal position at the moment is the result of economic policies which haven't suited the needs and interests of people who live in Scotland. Because last year, if you look at tax take, Scotland generated £800 more per person in tax than the UK average last year. Scotland has almost £100 billion worth of exports globally, and Scotland has a lower public spending per capita than the UK over the past 5 years. So Scotland has vast economic strengths. That's the first part of it. But my second point responds to your point of information more directly. Because independence isn't only about Scotland's current wealth or current relatively strong position in global terms. It's about making the most of opportunities in the future. So independence means Scotland will have power over taxation, labour rights, migration, industrial policy, trade and investment, and social security. So let's take 3 examples from that. Scotland has 7% control of tax powers at the moment, 7%. In the opposition, they want to move to something around 20% or 34%, depending on whether the Liberal Democrats are elected in 2015 or not.
Somehow I think that's going to be very unlikely.
So The problem here is that I think that is, it's splitting hairs. That we think it's better if Scotland has complete control over its tax and revenue. So you can fit the tax system around Scotland's key competitive advantages and economic strengths in some of the sectors that I've already mentioned. Or to take another example, immigration, where the system being imposed in Westminster, especially on universities, is a disincentive for young people from other countries to move to Scotland. Scotland needs more migration. It doesn't need a one-size-fits-all policy intended for London and the South East. The Institute of Fiscal Studies said that a more positive migration system could generate £65 billion more in revenue over future decades in Scotland. Or a third example, Scotland has vast renewable energy potential, but Westminster is focusing on new nuclear power plants. An independent Scotland can invest in those new technologies, can prioritise a North Sea energy grid, and gain the economic dividends of those investments. So if there's a problem with Scotland's fiscal balance at the moment, the argument of independence is that we can improve Scotland's economy, create more jobs, and make the most of Scotland's opportunities with the full powers of independence. And what's the alternative to this? I don't really think a convincing case has been made that there is an alternative for the best interests of Scotland's economy that can be derived from Westminster. All we have in the next point, talking about reform, is talk about uncertainty and risk from the opposite side of the debate. And you'll hear a lot of mentions of problems and risks and uncertainties, despite the fact that uncertainties and risks are a natural state of life. Whether the UK is going to be a member of the EU, for instance, whether Scotland's budget will be cut in future years if Scotland votes no. These are natural uncertainties. The question Scotland faces in the referendum is whether you want power in an uncertain world, whether you think it would be best to make decisions in your best interests within those changing circumstances. And they'll talk about the pound, no thank you, at the same time as their negotiating stance is that they would refuse Scotland the pound. Well, a UK minister says in private to journalists, quote, "Of course there would be a currency union." No thank you. Well, the Guardian newspaper journalist said that there was a quote to him stating that of course there would be a currency union. They act like oil is an albatross around Scotland's neck, when oil, as we all know, is a vast natural and an important resource, which the UK Oil and Gas Regulatory Group said would last at least until 2050, with the 15 to 24 barrels of oil already identified. Look at the facts, Cambridge. Don't take their uncertainties and risks at face value, because it's all assertion and self-interest from a Westminster political class that's growing in its irrelevance day by day. But the best response from their side is federalism, a proposal that you can reform the UK while still keeping Scotland as a member, giving Scotland full control, but keeping some of the wider structures in place. But the reality is that this is never going to happen. It's not on the ballot paper, and there's no real interest in providing this reform from within the UK. At the current rate, it would take 170 years for Scotland to control its own finances from Westminster. Why vote for a fiction when you can vote for the solution? Why maintain this centralised system of government at Westminster when Scotland can lead the way to greater decentralisation of power and greater local government after a yes vote? And this is why this matters for England too, because political reform for me doesn't stop at any border. This vote for principles for greater prosperity and for constitutional reform can create and inspire positive change in England. In an open letter from England to Scotland, a group of campaigners from fellows at various universities across England wrote, quote, "We don't see or fear Scottish independence as separation. We look forward to it as a better way of living together." That equal relationship that I spoke about at the start of this speech, that is England's opportunity. I believe that England, especially in the north, will benefit, especially if there's further devolution in England, after a yes vote for Scottish independence. Look at the Borderlands Initiative, which are a series of reports in practical terms of how economic policy, tourism and transportation can be greater integrated after Scotland becomes independent with the north east of England. That's the practical reality that won't be brought up, I suspect, in any of their speeches about barriers and borders that are non-existent and not in anyone's mutual interest. Ultimately, members of Cambridge Union, this debate is about creating a better way of working alongside each other as neighbouring nations. This movement for independence doesn't want to change the flag, it wants to change the country. And independence is a means to that greater end. It can support progress for Scotland and England. Vote tonight on the strengths of the arguments and the evidence. Vote on facts and not on fear, and vote for the motion tonight.
Fantastic speech.
Thank you very much, Michael. The floor now passes to Lord Wallace of TANKERNESS. Lord Wallace is a former Deputy First Minister of Scotland and twice acting First Minister. He is the leader of the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords, Lord Advocate General for Scotland and former MP for Orkney and Shetland. Lord Wallace, you have the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, can I thank very much the Cambridge Union for inviting me here to oppose the proposition here this evening. I do find it interesting because in November 1972, which wasn't yesterday, I made my maiden speech in this debating chamber when I argued the case for a Scottish Parliament within the United Kingdom. And little did I think then that I would actually have some part in bringing it about. But I do believe that the devolved settlement which we have as a step towards federalism, the devolved settlement which we have giving Scotland a whole range of powers over our domestic agenda, over education, over health, over internal transport, local government, police, the legal system, our prisons, our sports, culture, media, I think it's a very substantial devolution settlement, but at the same time retaining the security and the stability we have as part of the United Kingdom for overall economic policy, for our defence and for our foreign affairs. And I've actually been strengthened in my view that the best of both worlds of a Scottish Parliament within a United Kingdom from the experience we've had since 1999. And I'm proud here to be a Scot, but I'm also proud to be British, I'm proud to be European, and I'm proud of my adopted Orcadian heritage. And I don't think there's anything contradictory in any of these things, but what I'm being asked to do on the 18th of September is to choose between a British identity and a Scottish identity, because if Scotland votes yes, I will lose my British identity. I will no longer be British. And I do believe that that would be, not just for myself, but for so many people. Certainly. Aye.
You will still live in the British Isles. Oh, thank you. You will still live in the British Isles. You will still be part of Britain. You will still be British.
Well, I don't accept that, because I think I would be part of an independent Scotland, and I don't think that would be the same as actually sharing these islands with people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And that, I think, to me, would be actually a grievous loss. And I do believe it would be one which many people would feel and share. Because I do believe Scotland is stronger for being part of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is stronger with Scotland in it. Now, when I was, around about the time when I was an undergraduate, there was the film of the life of Brian, which I think has probably actually passed down through the generations and is still quite enjoyed by successive generations. And you remember that scene when John Cleese talked about what have the Romans ever done for us? And a few moments later, he rephrased it saying, apart from medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, fresh water system, sanitation, what have the Romans ever done for us? And I sometimes think it's a question we've got to ask. I mean, what has the UK ever done for Scotland, apart from giving us a strong and stable currency, apart from giving us the most successful political and monetary union in modern history, apart from the strongest growth in the G8, apart from the fact that together we forged a national health service, apart from the fact we have a single energy market for Scotland's renewable energy resources. And Michael makes a very important point, and he's right, that Scotland does have rich renewable energy resources, many of them around my former constituency in Orkney and Shetland. But in fact, the funding for that, the subsidies that come through that are actually applied to the electricity bills of every household in the United Kingdom. And if he's actually going to ask us to believe that when Scotland has walked away from the United Kingdom, that households in Brighton and Bournemouth and Cardiff are going to continue to pay that subsidy to actually develop the Scotland's renewable energy industry, then I sometimes wonder which kind of planet he's on. Yes, Michael, come on.
Well, Chris Goodall and Professor Peter Strachan both disagree with you. They're energy experts who say that because Scotland is an exporter of energy, it would, of course, still be in the rest of the UK's interest to have an integrated market with Scotland after independence.
I think it really begs the question as to whether households in England would be prepared to pay that subsidy. And if it's got to be paid by the much fewer tenth of the households that there are in Scotland, it would be very expensive. And of course, there are other sources for energy, not least from Ireland and from France. So I think if you're building your argument on that very sandy foundation, then heaven help us. I mean, you say, well, and what's the UK done for us, apart from being there to bail out our banks when they were near failing, apart from the single jobs market with no barriers to employment? And I accept there is a case, of course, that a different migration policy would be, that could attract labour to Scotland. But those who argue the case for a yes vote can't have it both ways. They can't say, we'll open the doors, and at the same time we will keep open the boundaries between Scotland and England. Because it's unthinkable that the rest of the United Kingdom would allow an open door policy in one part of these islands and not also want to actually close off or have a border post at the border. Now, I don't particularly want to see a border post. I think I was born and brought up 8 miles from the Scotland-England border. It would be an anathema to me to see that. But if you're actually going to have an open-door migration policy, then that would be a consequence of that, is that you would have to have some kind of border post between Scotland and England. What they've done, apart from higher education base, research base, that attracts a disproportionate funding from the UK research councils, and apart from a single tax and regulatory system which underpins 200,000 jobs in financial services. Now, I do believe that the United Kingdom has been good for Scotland, and Scotland's been good for the United Kingdom. We are a member of the European Union, the permanent member of the UN Security Council, the Council of Europe, the Commonwealth, NATO, the G7, G20, and that gives us, as Scots, part of the United Kingdom, an actual real clout in the world. The UK is the second largest donor of international aid in the world, aid administered largely from East Kilbride in Scotland. Together, we have championed democracy, we've championed the rule of law around the world, we've campaigned against slavery in the 18th century, we drafted the European Convention on Human Rights in the 1950s. Together, we resisted invasion and conquest, and nor did we fall for the ideologies that blighted our continent in the 20th century, but together we made sacrifices in opposing them. But it's not just historic, it's up to date too. The United Kingdom's Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative was the core theme of our presidency of the G8 in 2013, and it led in turn to a new United Nations Security Council resolution and General Assembly declaration on sexual violence within conflict. The United Kingdom was to the fore among states which launched the campaign for the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, which was finally adopted last year. Now, of course, Scotland outside the United Kingdom would have a very honourable record in these matters, but it would play a very small part. It would not have the presidency of the G20 to be able to take forward very important initiatives that actually have had resonance and have affected lives around the world. And I believe I want to be part of a country that has that kind of ability in the world stage to do good. In trade and investment, 70% of Scottish exports go to the rest of the United Kingdom. The Scottish economy depends on our trade with our neighbours in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And actually there's been some research done in Canada which shows that the difference between the trade between the provinces of Canada on the one hand and between Canada and the United States on the other is very marked, albeit that within Canada and the United States you've got the same language, they're members of the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, and yet the trade between provinces is so much greater than that when there is an international barrier created. And therefore I do believe that in spite of what was said, that the economic case for being part, and I've never doubted that Scotland could stand on its own 2 feet. No one on our side ever has challenged that. But I just think it would be so much better being part of that single European, that single British United Kingdom market, which has actually done us so well over the last 307 years. And security, we share risks within the United Kingdom. Economic volatility is easier to absorb within the whole United Kingdom than, for example, a fall in oil prices, which would disproportionately affect a much smaller country. The fall between, I think, 2011 and 2012 was something equivalent to half of Scotland's schools budget. Now, if that is just lost in Scotland, it has a real impact on the education of our young people. But within a wider United Kingdom of 60 million people, it is much more readily absorbed. Likewise, I do believe that we have the best of both worlds with hundreds of years of close cooperation, a highly integrated economy. The nations of the United Kingdom have yet remained distinctive. Scotland is not oppressed. I mean, we are a country which voluntarily entered into a union. We have not, it's okay, Michael, I've given you away once or twice. We have not been oppressed in any way. We're not held against our will within this union. The very fact that the United Kingdom government cooperated with the Scottish government in making the legal provision for a referendum shows that there is no political oppression in that, and the people of Scotland will have the right to make our own decision on the 18th of September. But perhaps one of the best tributes to the strength of our United Kingdom and what it does mean positively for people in Scotland is the arguments which the Yes campaign themselves put forward. In the Scottish Government's white paper, they tell us the things that they want. They want to keep the shared monarchy. They want to keep our currency. They want to keep the Bank of England. They want to keep the National Lottery. They want to keep the National Health Service Blood Transfusion and Transplant Service. They want to keep the Royal Mint. They want to keep the Higher Education Research Councils. They want to keep the Air and Maritime Accident Investigation branches. They want to keep the Committee on Radioactive Waste Management. They want to keep the Green Investment Bank. They want to keep the Met Office. They want to keep the Hydrographic Office. They want to keep the UK benefit system. They want to keep the DVLA. If there ever was an endorsement for the United Kingdom, it comes from the yes side. And therefore, Mr. President, I beg to suggest to this House that the most positive case for the United Kingdom is made by the Yes campaign itself, because all in all, they actually want all that's good about the United Kingdom.
Great, Dan. Thank you very much, Lord Wallace. It's now time for you to have your say, so we move to the floor speeches. Would anyone like to make a point in proposition of the motion?
Cheers. Thank you. Douglas Morton, Christ College. It was interesting that Lord Wallace mentioned the unforgettable episode in Monty Python's Life of Brian about what have the Romans ever done for us. Where's the Roman Empire today? We've moved on. It might have had some good things, like giving us another subject to study in school when we couldn't think anything else, but it's moved on. Even if it's produced good things in the past, this is time to begin a new chapter. But I want to make a more general point, which I hope's picked up on. Often people on the left will say that if we try to become independent, we're not showing sufficient solidarity with the rest of the UK. This is a very strange argument because it reminds me of the Monty Python's Life of Brian again, because in that film, it bears many of the similarities with the Better Together campaign. It's surreal and it's ridiculous in many ways, and this is one of their arguments. And I think if the left says that we should stay in the UK to promote solidarity, and therefore allow a region of these islands to continue to be governed by the Conservative Party, this isn't a progressive vision. If the left wants us to be progressive and to make progress, then Scotland should go its own way, should set an example to the rest of these islands, and then the rest of the country, the rest of the UK can see that living under Tory rule is not desirable, so we can be the beacon of hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Do we have a speech in opposition to the motion? Preferably not Life of Brian related, but to push. Yeah, the gentleman over there.
Jerome Greenfield, St Catherine's College. I find it quite striking that you should cite the construction industry, the tourist industry, as reasons to suppose that Scotland could be sustainable economically, given that those industries, as far as I understand them, are very dependent upon things like the EU, for which membership is not guaranteed as such for an independent Scotland. The other thing is you didn't touch at all on things like the establishment of security services, foreign embassies, legations, diplomatic missions and so forth, which is something that an independent Scotland would obviously need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we have a speech in abstention of the motion? At the back, yeah.
I think this is especially true of the first speaker for the proposition. The motion is this House believes Scotland should be an independent country. I do not have a vote. My mother is Scottish. She does not have a vote because we live in England. So for everyone in this room who lives in England, and I'm betting it's about 95%, maybe even as high as 99%, we have no vote. So I would ask all the future speakers to refrain from suggesting that we are about to be able to have a decision in what is going to happen. This is a discussion about what we think, not how we vote in September, because we have no voice. Although I am clearly, I think, frustrated about that. Thank you.
Catherine, although of course the world does actually hang on the outcomes of Cambridge Union debates. You should take it jolly seriously. The world's dictators were squirming in their shoes when we regretted the Arab Spring, or rather jumping for joy. Does anyone have a point in proposition of the motion? Over at the back.
Thank you. Ruby Zajak, Newnham College. The opposition talked a lot about all the things that we have to be proud of as members of the United Kingdom, but there are a lot of things that I think many members of both Scotland and England are not proud of, such as our involvement in the Iraq War. And Scotland, I think, definitely wouldn't have taken the decision to partake in that and many other decisions that the UK has made, and I think that should be taken into account. Thank you.
As elected in 2003, voted in favour of British military intervention in Iraq. I moved the motion against it.
Fantastic. Punch and Judy politics, quite literally. Which one's Judy? I don't know, Nick. You figure it out for yourself. Any points in opposition to the motion? Any in the balcony? Because I usually forget them. Yeah.
Ryan Frost, Christ College. I want to make a point directly related to Douglas's about the left-leaning individuals in the room. I empathise with what Scotland wants to do, the emphasis on renewable energy and the dedication to higher education, and I too condemn everything that the coalition government has done so far in terms of tuition fees and all that. But I want everyone to spare a thought for the left-leaning English people, Welsh people, Irish people, because if Scotland goes independent and we lose all the Labour seats in the north and the other seats as well, we'll be condemned to successive Tory rule forever. And I can't bear that thought. So for the good of all of us, I hope that Scotland sticks with it and sticks with the Union, so we can at least have some kind of variety in our political rule. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we have a point in abstention of the motion? Yeah, you've had your hand up.
Daniel Hyman, Sydney, Sussex. One of the big genies in the bottle is there's often talk about Scotland's place in the United Kingdom, but what about Scotland and the United Kingdom's place in the European Union? Why is the only solution to have an independent Scotland, independent United Kingdom, versus, say, European federalism? Because arguably, as the world goes forward, the only bloc that is big enough to challenge the world and actually be a force in the world is the European Union.
Well, you can never please everyone with these motions, I suppose. Run for president, Dan. I think we'll move on with the main debate now, although there will be plenty more opportunities for speeches from you and wisecracks from me later on. So now the floor passes to Pete WISHART MP. Pete is the SNP member for Perth and North Perthshire. He is the party's Westminster spokesperson for the Constitution, Home Affairs, Culture, Media and Sport, and International Development. Pete, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this very kind invitation to speak this evening in Cambridge University. This is now a clean sweep because I had the great pleasure of this seemed to be an Oxford Union last year. I'm just going to say one last thing about Monty Python, and I think this is all we could say with a great deal of certainty. We'll never get always look on the bright side of life from the miserablism and Project Fear No campaign, that's for certain. But ladies and gentlemen, something remarkable is happening in Scotland. You can almost sense it in the air. You could feel it in practically every community and constituency in our great little country. There's a real sense that this is a nation that's moving on. A nation deciding, we want to do something different. We want to do something better. We're going to take advantage of this incredible opportunity that is being presented to us and make our own way in the world. This is a nation deciding that we want to make our own international contribution. We want to make our own way in the world. We want to always have the government that we vote for. We're also deciding lots of things that we don't. I don't think Scotland any longer wants to be the receptacle for the biggest arsenal of weapons of mass destruction in the whole of Europe. I think this is a Scotland that's deciding we don't want any more Tory governments with their austerity plans and their obscenities like the bedroom tax. We don't want any more of Labour's illegal wars. This is a Scotland that is moving on. This is a nation that's beginning to find itself. And you know why this is happening? We're not scared anymore. We are a confident nation. We've seen that we can do it. We run our parliament. We know we do things better. And we know that if in the hands of the Scottish people, we'll do things better. We'll do things better because we care more about our country. Of course we care more about our country than the Westminster Tories do. It makes absolute sense. Oh, I won't bother. I'll take one intervention from the back. But so, of course, the people of Scotland will run our nation better than the Westminster Tories, so you could feel it. We're still behind in the opinion polls. Yeah, I could see that. We're still behind, but we're catching up. Last summer, we were way behind. For them, it was about how big will the victory be? It was about bayoneting the wounded. We're not hearing that anymore. Several things have happened about how the Scottish people have changed in their attitude about this debate, but there's two very important and significant things that happened. The first was the production of the Scottish Government's white paper, which happened at the end of last year. 670 pages, giving a blueprint and a glimpse of how an independent Scotland would work and operate. It was only an SNP one. There are other ones that are available. There's the Jimmy Reid Foundation, there's the Commonweal, there's even some of the other younger groups are coming up with their own models about how an independent Scotland would work. It was important that the Scottish people got the facts and information about how our country would look, and that changed everything. The opinion polls started to contract. Then another very significant thing happened, probably a more important thing. And it wasn't us that did it, it was them that did this. It was when the Chancellor came to Scotland and delivered what is now referred to as the Sermon on the Pound. When he told the Scottish people the currency that we thought we shared with everybody else in Ireland was in fact nothing to do with us, and he, as a Tory Chancellor, would deny us the use of it. That was the same week when they told us that we'd be thrown out of Europe. It was the same week that we were told that we wouldn't be part of the great British institutions like the BBC, and we were told that big business would be leaving an independent Scotland. With one grand assault, Scotland was supposed to be brought back into fearful line. That was why they did this. But something almost beautiful happened. Something that makes me just admire and respect my fantastic little country even more. Instead of being scared and frightened about being brought back into fearful line, it made them angry, agitated, and emboldened. Instead of going like that in the opinion polls, they went like that. Because we are a country and we are a nation that will not be told by them anymore. They have completely and utterly got the national mood in Scotland totally and absolutely wrong. And it has changed everything. I'll take the point at the back there.
I don't think it's fair that you appoint yourself the patron saint. Rather than speaking for we, could you speak for some people think? I think that's possibly a more balanced approach.
Well, I'm very grateful to the lady for that particular intervention, because this is what we're finding here. Now, I don't know what type of information you're getting about what's happening in Scotland, but please have a look. Have the conversations about how our nation is dramatically changing, about how emboldened we feel, and just this response to this nonsense. Now, they call themselves Project Fear. That's their term for it. That wasn't us that invented it. That's what they go to their office every day and sit down. How do we scare the people of Scotland? Because to win, what they have to do to win is for the Scottish people to go to the ballot box on this 18th of September to be frightened or to be uncertain, to be scared about the future, about stopping making them that positive choice. Yes, sir, go on.
Thomas Saunders, St John's College. You talk about how the No campaign would like the Scottish people, or rather people who live in Scotland, to go to the ballot box fearful. I imagine, of course, you'd rather they went there, what, ignorant?
Well, I'll tell you something we did, and we were criticised for this. We were criticised for having a 2-year-long campaign for Scottish independence. Thank goodness we did. I hosted a meeting in Perth, in my constituency, on Monday. 200 people turned up. People are turning out in their droves to be engaged in this debate. What we want is an informed electorate. We want people to go there with the absolute right amount of information that they require. And if that comes from, we were waiting for the positive case from them. We've not had it yet. We've got a white paper. It's like this. We've got nothing from them. So this is why we want to be people as informed as possible. So I'm grateful that we're having this extended debate. But you know what Project Fear's become just now? Project Farce. Do you know what they're actually trying, what they said in the last few weeks? And it was George Robertson, a former Shadow Secretary of State, a former Defence Secretary. He went up and spoke in New York and said that if independent Scotland would be cataclysmic for the Western world, that forces of darkness would be cheering us on. They then went on to scare us about alien invasion. This is what Project Fear is. People are laughing at them now. And this is why these opinion polls are contracting. And this is... sorry, I've got no more time. Thank you. This is what is actually happening here. So we are getting very, very close to what this... Because it's now Scotland will be told, and it's totally game on. Now, I want to try and debunk a few of the myths that we're hearing about this, so just to help you when we discover what's going on just now. They call it... Their great word is separation. That's all we hear is... Even all the Westminster committees now... It's the impact of separation of that, separation of that. So that's a big word, and that's the word that they use. We're not interested in separating from anybody. All we want is to govern ourselves, to make our own contribution to world affairs and make sure that we can do this. And we know we need our own government. If we look at the UK opinion polls just now, and I'm sorry to, I don't know if it was a gentleman in the back, but it's just the reality of where we are in the UK. The latest opinion polls have shown the parties of the right, anything between 45 and 50% just now. That's UKIP and the Tory combined. We don't do UKIP in Scotland. They've lost every single deposit. We barely do Tory. We've got one Tory member of Parliament. We've got more giant pandas than him. But yet... we have to get Tory government. We don't do that. Why don't we... Here's a suggestion. Here's a novel thing that we should maybe think about doing. Why doesn't the rest of the United Kingdom elect the government that they want, that they feel comfortable with, and we'll do the same? Because that is what it is all about. It's about democracy and ensuring that we get the government doing the things that we vote for and we approve of. And always in an independent Scotland, that will be the case. No, I've not got time. I've got my things coming up. And then they try and say, this is about nationalism. I'm not bothered about nationalism. I reject that tag. I couldn't care less. I believe in international solidarity. I believe in interdependence. I believe in social democracy. They characterise me as a nationalist as nonsense. Then they try and say something like ethnic nationalism. It's nothing whatsoever to do with this. I'm a proud Scot. And I want to make sure that people who live and work in Scotland govern themselves. That's what this is about. Nothing to do with nationalism. And we'll be best friends, people. You're our best friends and neighbours. All this foreigners nonsense we're getting from them, forget all about that. Their border posts and foreigners agenda, it's so insulting to you. We'll give you a wave of welcome to come to the independent. Come and live there, enjoy it. This is the sort of thing that we want to try and achieve. So reject this border post foreigners nonsense, because that is exactly what it is. Scotland is on the move. You could sense it. You could feel it in the air. You could see it in all our communities. And what a prize. What a prize if we take this. For the first time in 300 years, we get a country of our own.
Thank you, Pete. The floor now passes to Anne Maguire MP. Anne is the member for Stirling and Shadow Minister for Disabled People. She's a former Scotland Minister and Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Leader of the Opposition. Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I frankly didn't recognise the Scotland that Pete Wishart identified. I don't feel that I've lived as a wee, coor and timorous beastie in Scotland for the last, I'll not tell you how many years, of my life. I certainly don't think the Scots have ever seen themselves colonised, held down, and somehow intimidated by English people. I also, and this may come as a surprise to you, I didn't vote for the government I wanted in Scotland. I didn't vote for the SNP. And 75% of the population of Scotland didn't vote for the SNP government in Scotland. And you know what? I accept that because that's democracy and that's the way we operate. And this myth that comes from the SNP that somehow, no, just give me a second or two, that somehow by erecting a border at Hadrian's Wall, which incidentally, of course, was built by the Romans, no, not just now, wasn't even a natural boundary in this island, but was built because of the logistical imperatives of the Romans, that somehow that will assume that Scotland, people in Scotland will always get the government that they voted for. Now, frankly, I represent Stirling, and I want you to know that Stirling is key to the history of Scotland. In 1314, of course, and we celebrate that this year, we had the Battle of Bannockburn. We tended to have these skirmishes with the English army under English kings, who quite often were related to the Scottish kings that they were fighting, but that's another matter. We also had the Battle of Stirling Bridge. But we also, in 1603, or in the late 16th century, had the coronation of the king who eventually became the King of Scotland and the King of England, and that was James I and VI. So I represent an area which is actually at the heart of Scottish history. And frankly, what I have heard tonight makes me fearful. You'll notice at one point, Mr. Speaker, in spite of the blandishments that Mr. Wishart gave to the students, he talked about them, and we are them. And one of the issues that we do have to address, and I have to be frank with you down here, is there is an interpretation abroad that if you do not accept the theory that you have to be an independent Scotland, then somehow you're speaking against the best interests of Scotland. Now, frankly, that is just not true. What we have is a debate of what is in the best interests of Scotland. Some of us feel that that means staying with the United Kingdom. So it's not a debate about whether or not Scotland can be an independent country. It's a debate about whether or not we should be an independent country. Of course, Michael.
The problem isn't an us and them of identity. It's an us and them of progress. Now, I heard yourself and Jim give these exact same speeches in Oxford last Thursday.
Yeah, we heard yours
and I
as well.
said that, and I'll talk about it, and I changed it, and gave you the context of change that's happening in Scotland and the diverse groups in Scotland that are supporting independence for a better future. Where's your idea of a better future? Where's your practical alternative that people in this room can listen to, understand and respect?
Yep.
What we have in Scotland just now are two grassroots organisations. The Yes campaign, which incidentally gets about 80% of its money from one donor, and No campaign, which has actually generated money from a significant number of people on the grassroots. But let me go on to the positive case, because sometimes I do think that that hasn't got across quite as well as it has, that it ought to be. Scotland, the United Kingdom is an island of only 800 miles from north to south. And our countries together have achieved so much. We entered into an agreement in 1707 where we would join together as two countries to create one state. Let me be quite frank with you. Nobody has ever denied that the Scots are a nation. We feel Scottish, we are Scottish. There has never been any attempt to undermine that Scottishness. And over that time, we have created the Bank of England together, which was founded by a Scot, as was the BBC, the NHS by a Welshman, and the welfare state by an Englishman. The UK is a country that talks about the positive advantage of internationalism in the world, and we were, in fact, the first to promote that internationhood, if I could put it that way. We were at peace in these islands when the rest of Europe was tearing itself apart during the 17th and 18th centuries. And, of course, we came together to help Europe retain its freedom earlier on in the last century. Yes, of course.
People in Ireland did stuff with England when we were still part of the Republic of Ireland, when we were still part of the UK. That doesn't necessarily mean there shouldn't be a Republic of Ireland. Saying that happened in the past does not mean you can't have independence.
I actually have I've heard the argument about Ireland on one or two occasions in the debate. The issue about Ireland is quite different from the issue of Scotland, and I think the honourable gentleman, excuse me, well, you probably are an honourable gentleman, unless maybe students are really well behaved in Cambridge, I don't know. But I think it's a wrong analogy, and I think it's a false analogy. We're talking about when Scotland has entered into an agreement with the rest of the United Kingdom, not just with England, but with the other countries of the United Kingdom. And I noticed, actually, just to pick up on something that Pete Wishart talked about at the end of his speech, when he mentioned all of the things that it would benefit students here, how wonderful it would be. The one thing he didn't mention is that the Scottish Government's position currently is, and in the future will be, that students from other parts of the United Kingdom actually will still pay fees in Scotland under an independent country, even though under EU rules they don't have to do it for other European countries. So that welcome will be there. That's good neighbourhood indeed, Jim. So to me, erecting barriers where there are none and to divorce ourselves from those neighbours in England, Wales and Ireland frankly is not the way to meet the challenges of an increasingly complex global world. In a country that prides itself on having an international outlook, as Scotland does, and quite rightly should take pride in that, it strikes me that the first example of that internationhood should be held on to. We as Scots helped create the United Kingdom. We are not lodgers in our own house. This is our country of the United Kingdom, every bit as much as it is anybody else's. And of course, on the economy, and they always bring up issues relating to the economy, most Scottish firms benefit from being able to sell their goods in other parts of the United Kingdom, mainly to England. Estimates vary between 60 and 70%. I can't remember if it was Michael that talked about our exports. Most of our exports go actually into the English market. Our farmers sell into the English market. Our manufacturers sell into the English market. And as Jim pointed out, in terms of renewable development, we need that wider support from the English market, i.e. from those who pay for electricity, to support our renewable industries. So we are part and integrated. And frankly, all the bluff and bluster that we hear from Alex Salmond saying that it isn't true will not make it any different. Now, we've heard a wee bit about the white paper, the 650 pages. Well, frankly, if you want to have a good read at it between your exams, it will not take you too long because it's the biggest piece of fiction since the Grimm brothers died. It mentions come dancing more often than it does the Scots whisky industry because they're frightened that people in Scotland, as they start to investigate the implications of independence, will start to realise that some of the things that we have paid into and we take for granted, such as the BBC, will no longer be with us. So, no, I think I have just been given the nod that it's time to move into a peroration. But can I say this to you, that in Scotland we value the partnership that we have had with the rest of the United Kingdom. We have celebrated with our colleagues and our friends and our families in England, Wales and Ireland as part of that United Kingdom. We have been a force for good in the world as part of the United Kingdom. And the stuff that Pete tries to manufacture about the pound, let us be under no illusions. If Pete wants a currency union, there is a currency union there just now, and it's called the United Kingdom. We do not need to have independence to re-establish a currency union under the pound. Now, he doesn't like the fact that George Osborne, Ed Balls and Danny Alexander said there will not be a currency union. But the reality is that you cannot walk away from Britain and still expect, as Jim Wallace said, to keep all the benefits of being part of Britain. It just doesn't compute. And I would hope that instead of some of the fairy tales that we've been getting from the SNP over the last number of months, then we should start to get a bit of truth. Now, finally, I will tell you this. There's been one or two myths that somehow it's all coming together in Scotland. Well, if I tell you that the last opinion poll, which was published on Sunday, actually saw the gap between yes and no widening with no in the ascendancy, a 20% gap. But we are not complacent about this. This is something that we will never have to face in our lives again, hopefully. Something that we have never faced before. What Pete and his colleagues are asking is that the Scottish people take apart a 300-year-old union, the most successful social and political union and economic union probably in history. They're asking us to tear it asunder, not because they want rid of the bedroom tax, not because they want welfare reform, not because David Cameron is the Prime Minister, but because what gets the nationalists up in the morning and has got them up in the morning before the bedroom tax, before David Cameron was born, before anything that exists today, is the fact that they have always wanted to separate Scotland out from England. John Smith, one of our great founding leaders, said that he was both a patriot, but he was never a nationalist. I think in Scotland, we know the difference between being a Scot and being separate from our friends and our colleagues and our families in other parts of the United Kingdom. There are around 700,000 Scots, maybe 800,000, that live in England, Scots-born people that live in England. There are around 400,000 English-born people that live in Scotland. We have been a country without barriers for 307 years. We are 800 miles from top to bottom. I would say to you that it is madness for us to separate such a small island, such an integrated community, such an integrated economy from each other, all because the Romans built a wall at Hadrian's Wall.
Thank you, Anne. It's now time for the final round of floor speeches. So would anyone like to make a point in proposition of the motion? You've had your hand up several times.
This is Zach Hassan, Jesus College. I feel quite sorry for my English brothers and sisters who are standing here, because I think as someone who's followed the debate for quite some time, doesn't know how I'm quite going to use my vote yet, I'm very disappointed with the quality of the speeches that have been here today, and I'll tell you why. Oh, yeah. Okay, because I'm going to offer a different picture. Real people in Scotland don't parrot what either of these sides say. Although I thank the first prop because he actually tried to offer some of the statistics and figures. I did notice that, yeah. But the official campaigns, and people know this in Scotland, they just spout, and I hope I can go on the record of saying this, shite. They spout shite, both of them. Optimistic shite from the Yes campaign, and scaremongering shite from the No campaign. Now, people in Scotland are not interested in that. They're not interested in what the values are. They feel British, they feel Scottish. It doesn't matter. They want to know what is the information so that they can make their mind up about how to vote. Now, I want to ask, I'm speaking in proposition because there's one argument that I really want to hear an answer from the no side, and it's the democratic argument. Because people in Scotland have never voted for the Tory party for about 40 years. And it goes worse than that, because when they vote for the Labour Party, it's not because they voted for the Labour Party, it's because the south of England, the swing voters, have changed their mind. And those are the voters that Westminster parliamentarians go after. They're not interested in Scotland. Why shouldn't we take the opportunity to vote for people who actually do care about our opinion?
Thank you, Zach. Actually, shite is entirely admissible in here. Obviously in the linguistic as opposed to biological sense. The only thing you're not allowed to say is stuff which breaches the laws of England and Wales. Not interestingly enough, Scotland. So, yeah. I'm sure someone's going to have a bone to pick with me after this. Any points in opposition?
Lily Mortimer from Homerton College. Much of Mr Wishart's speech centred around the lack of representative democracy in Scotland, even cracking everybody's favourite Tories versus Pandas joke. But your speech seems to have forgotten that the Scottish Parliament exists. It exists. It has a radically different political makeup, which as a member of the SNP you should know, and it has considerable power over its domestic affairs. But it is a young institution, and that's something that the first proposition speaker came up with. So it's not that we have exhausted its full potential and that there's no other options. If you're looking for greater control over policies that affect Scotland, look to Edinburgh, not to independence.
Thank you, Lily. Do we have a point in abstention of the motion? Gentleman at the front.
Thomas Simpson, Gonville and Keys College. I found it interesting that one of the main arguments in this debate was that Scotland doesn't like the Tories, hence we should split off. And Ryan told us in a floor point that, no, maybe we want the Scots so we can defeat the Tories in England. This got this centre-right Kiwi Englishman thinking. Maybe we do want the maybe we don't want the Scots because they won't vote Tory. But then I also thought, maybe we don't want the Welsh either. Maybe we don't want the Cornish. Maybe we don't want people from certain areas of London. Maybe we don't want people who happen to attend King's College. Or alternatively, maybe we could look at this debate from the perspective of not trying to gerrymander electorates based on what would personally benefit our ideology and actually debate what would be better for everyone.
In the Wars of Independence, when Scotland has told England, no, get lost, it's happened within 20 miles of Stirling, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge and at the Battle of Bannockburn. So it seems appropriate that I should be standing here to tell the rest of the UK where to go once again. Much like Zach told you here, I feel myself, and many of the others in Scotland do who have been exposed to this argument for about a year now, many of us consider ourselves horrendously ill-qualified to even pick for ourselves whether Scotland should be an independent country. There are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, because it's been alluded to before, it's not what we expected. For many years, we've been looking for what's been called Devo Max, for more powers as Lord Wallace has been offering. But there's no second question, so we're going to pick between the status quo or, I guess, the nuclear option. We're going to go it alone. So we start from scratch, and you'd think then that in a proper democratic form, if we'd been well informed about both sides, we'd be able to choose, right? Not quite, because firstly, it's all mired in uncertainty, this choice. Will we keep the pound? Will we keep the EU? Will we keep Trident? Will we, how much of the national debt and the oil will we take? None of this we know. It will all be decided after, and effectively voting yes is just voting for whether we think Alex Salmond can get us a good deal. But secondly, there's been an overwhelming lack of debate because the two sides have been unwilling, on the whole, to engage with one another. And yet, in the absence of any of these, which are necessary to make a proper informed decision, we have to make the jump sort of blind, and we should. Because for a lot of reasons, it's better to be small, it's better to be ourselves, and it's better to go it alone, and this is why. So first of all, it's easy to get caught up in the great fright of breaking away from what's seen as a cushy position within the United Kingdom. We've heard all about the expense of the Scottish Government and about how it wouldn't be able to sustain its spending for anything longer than we've got. But we've got to remember is that that's on the background of a lack of control over most of its budget, both in income and expenditure, which has been exposed all down this side. A small, freestanding country, of course, has to live within its means, and it will be more able to make sure that its spending is sustainable. Like, simply just looking at Scottish spending and going, that's huge, is firstly non-comparative, because as was pointed out, it doesn't take account of the fact that everyone runs budget deficits like it's the popular way to get back into government, right? But it's also not a reason for saying that we can't trust them to run their own ship when given proper control of it. And it's proper control that I'll move on to now. Because we've heard plenty about how side opposition would see, like, what they would seek to give us if we were to stay with them. You know, they listened to Lord Wallace's speech. They told us all the things that the UK has given us, as well as a list of all the things that they would like to give us if we were to stay with them, our police, our health, our whatever. All see the list that came earlier. It was slightly too long for me to remember it all or to write it down quickly enough. It seems on the face of it, that list anyway, to be too good to refuse. Why should we turn down the opportunity to have all of those things under our own power? But, large though it sounds, it is still so much as 2/3 controlled by the government of Westminster, because we only get 33% or however much of our income powers, and we don't get the opportunity to spend all of that in the right ways that we wanted to. It's simply not worth having freedom of control without having the freedom to do properly what they want with it, when half of the time it will most likely be under the overtone of a government whose priorities are not always aligned with Scotland. And this is not Tory bashing, ladies and gentlemen. This is under the Labour government, Lib Dems and Tories, regardless of what we've heard from Zach, Tom and Ryan up here. And regardless of what the concessions we have, what power we're given is simultaneously shackled to Westminster. We've got to remember how much Scotland has changed politically and socially, even as part of the UK. Even though we are, many of us, happy to identify as British, Scottish, whatever. But look at the changes that have happened even there, even while we're together, even while we're under Labour or Tory control. In Scotland, where the health service is the service over which we have the most power, as it were, to do as we look at the difference that it's made. NHS Scotland and NHS England are a world apart, and that's under Labour governance and Tory governments. I've stopped banging on about that now. Where we've had this control, NHS Scotland is more prosperous, it's better controlled, and it's more able to serve its population as a whole with a true, universal, effective health service. Note that whenever you hear in the news about the NHS being mismanaged or it being sold off to the private sector, you are talking about NHS England, not NHS Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, which are of themselves separate entities. Yeah, go ahead. Wait. Get on, Mike.
That's generally because those stories are reported by the London press rather than the Scottish press. I'm sure if you look in the Scottish press, I mean, I don't live in Scotland, but I'm sure if you read the Scotsman, there are probably plenty of stories about mismanagement in the NHS in Scotland.
But we're not selling it off. Not even whether or not you believe that selling it off is an appropriate description for what is happening. Nothing of the right-wing policies which are affecting the National Health Service in England are affecting those down here. It's not just a factor of news coverage. It's not just a tidbit that comes out because news is reported from London, which kind of seems like we ought to run away and make our own news anyway, but hey. Either way, regardless of what has happened in the past, it seems so clearly in the NHS that Scotland and the rest of the UK are growing apart in our political views. And if half of the time Scotland has to try and spend Lord Wallace's prizes under the influence of a government we voted more or less wholly against, then those prizes are not prizes, and those prizes are not worth having. We want the full package. We want them all on our own. So let's not be shy, let's be confident. Let's trust in our own power, our worth, and our identity. Let's be happy to stand before the rest of the UK as a kilted ginger bloke and say, thanks very much, the rest of the UK, but no thank you. We want our own, we beg to propose.
Thank you, Callum. The floor now passes, finally, to Ben Adams. Now, there are two Ben Adamses. One is a World Universities Debating Championship grand finalist and British debating champion. Unfortunately, he was busy tonight, so couldn't come. This guy just describes himself as a simple Scotsman, but I'm sure in spite of that, he has a great deal to say. So without further ado, Ben.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. It's lovely to be here, ladies and gentlemen, in my official capacity as the only Scottish person Michael could call on at short notice. I hope I can... Oh, that's true. I hope, by the way, I can give a speech of sufficient quality for the highly discerning gentleman in the corner who thinks that anything that isn't a list of facts is shite. I will have some facts, but not all facts. I didn't have time to look them all up. I was doing metaphysics revision. I want to talk about broadly three things that I think are important to this debate. First of all, I want to talk about politics. Second of all, I want to talk about economics. And finally, I want to talk about nationalism, which is subtitled, Isn't That a Bit 19th Century? But before that, though, I want to make a couple of remarks. The first is on the weirdly contradictory nature of the government case this evening, because on the one hand, they've told us we need change, we need radical change for Scotland, we need to take control of our own destiny. And then we've gone, all right, well, what about immigration? And they said, well, we'll leave that open. And then we said, what about the energy market? And they said, oh, well, we'll integrate that. And then we said, what about the currency or the monarchy or the military? And they said, oh, well, we'll keep those. Even the gentleman said, what about British identity? He said, well, that doesn't have to change either. And by the way, we want the pound. Like, what is the radical change that they've been calling for? and the other thing they've said is that there's no positive case. But as the previous gentleman says, we're going into this blind. We're going into this on the 617 pages that contains only one policy to do with economics, which is a 3% cut in the top rate of corporation tax for the richest people in Scotland. That's not Red Clydeside, as government wanted to tell you. The third thing I want to object to is the presumption on behalf of the rhetoric, and the first speaker who told us, he gave us a list of grassroots organisations. We're grassroots campaigners, despite 80% of it being paid for by Brian Souter. But secondly, sorry, not Brian Souter, one donor. And the populist patriotism from Peter Wishart, our nation, our vote, our people, our Scotland, the I love my country more than you do rhetoric made me think I'd stumbled into a Republican primary race. What I just want to point out is over 50% of people in Scotland at the moment do not agree with them. But that's what nationalism does. It says, if you're not a nationalist, you're not pro-independence, you're not our people, you're not our Scotland, you're not our vote. We are our Scotland. We're as Scottish as you are, and that is not incompatible with saying we have a future in Britain. First thing I want to talk about then, politics. Let's address the gentleman's point directly. The democratic deficit. Scotland wants control over its own decisions. It wants influence over what happens to it. Fine. It's got that. A person in Glasgow can vote for their MP and send that MP to Westminster to influence policy. That is the same amount of influence that a person from Bradford or from London or from Birmingham gets over what happens to them in Westminster. So perhaps the problem is, well, Westminster doesn't always make policy in the regional interest of Scotland. But it also doesn't make regional policy targeted at Cornwall. And the Scottish Parliament will not always make policy in the regional interests of Fife. That's not an argument for the secession of Fife. We're going to have to logically draw a barrier somewhere. It's no less arbitrary drawing it around Scotland than it is around the UK as a whole and having a Scottish Parliament as we do. The second thing that's incompatible with this democratic deficit they want to talk about, Scottish votes for Scottish people, is they want to join the EU. And by the way, it's not England, it's not David Cameron that says they can't, it's President Barroso who says they can't, of the European Union, right? But we'd suggest that wanting to join the EU is incompatible with their Scottish votes for Scottish people stance. They're happy to let German people and French people and Italian people vote on what policies affect Scotland. Why aren't they happy to let English people vote on what policies affect Scotland? But But what they also haven't pointed out is that just because we withdraw from London politically doesn't mean we opt out of the effect of British policy on us. Our economies are so integrated and our peoples are so integrated that what our monetary and fiscal policy does from the Bank of England has a huge impact on jobs, on businesses, on the economic wealth of Scotland. That doesn't change if we go independent. But what does change is we lose the influence that we have over those policies, right? So there's less influence, not more, over their side of the house. But I think I know what the problem here is. The problem with the democratic deficit is they don't like the Tory party. That's their problem. And it's just not the case that the Scottish people are vastly more left-wing than their English counterparts. They've set this up as sort of caring, like social democracy in Scotland, UKIP in England, which obviously isn't true. No, thank you. It is true that there are no Tories in Scotland. It's like trying to find a salad. But it's not true. But it's not true that there are no right-wing people in Scotland. 70% of Scots supported a cap on welfare. The three socialist parties in Scotland received less than 20,000 votes. And the only policy we know that is going to happen post-independence is a 3% cut on the top rate of corporation tax, which is either going to lead to a disastrous race to the bottom in rates of tax with England, or no businesses will move at all, and we just have less tax on the richest. Those aren't sensible policies. Those are vaguely Tory policies. Let's move on then and talk a little bit more about economics. And the case here has been, well, a new Scotland would be viable. Yes, of course it would be viable. All that means is it's not going to descend into anarchy. With the exception of Dundee High Street on a Friday night, that is broadly true. Like, our point isn't it would be viable. We say we want better than viable out of Scotland. And we say we get that on our side of the house. The big thing to talk about here is currency. Because a formal currency union has now been ruled out. Just ruled out. It's not on the table. You're not getting it. The best thing they can have is an informal continued use of the sterling, which is the one policy that the SNP's own fiscal commission said just wasn't going to work, that they couldn't do. And the only response we've heard from this, not just from the government here today, but from the SNP campaign more generally, has been to say, well, that wasn't fair of George Osborne. That's not a substantive response. That's not a substantive alternative, right? What money will I have in my wallet when I go home to Aberdeen come 2017, right? No answer, no answer. The second thing to talk about here is oil. It exists, it will run out in 2015, or as they say, it's okay, it'll run out in 2050. Look, the union has stood for 307 years. I think we should think longer than the next 40. Right? Which is, if that's as far as their thinking is going. But even if that's not true, having the entirety of your economy based on, or huge sections of your economy on a very volatile resource is a very bad idea. The reason for that is prices circulate very, very quickly. They dropped by 4.5 billion last year in 2013. That's more than the budget of the NHS, the NHS in Scotland. It's very difficult to accommodate those kinds of massive changes in revenue if you're a small country of 6 million people. Far better to have a broad, diverse economy that can absorb macroeconomic shock. Look at my terminology. All right, let's finally talk then about nationalism. I'll take an intervention if anyone's got one. Michael, rock it up.
Correct. There's been little or poor engagement in this debate as a whole, and I notice you've not responded to any of the 4 points I made, which aren't based on nationalism or identity or on shock and risk.
Economics.
It's about how do we decentralise an economic model where most economic and political powers in the southeast of England and Westminster. You agree that you want to decentralise it. A yes vote is the best method and process of achieving it.
The Scottish government has had tax powers since 1999. We're happy to say larger than that. We don't need complete loss of the union for that. But secondly, the economic case is not just about tax powers. You have to consider all the other economic externalities that I've talked about. I think it's fairly obvious that those would counteract the benefit of tax-making powers. You can have all the tax-making powers you like. If all the businesses have been driven off by red Clydeside policies and gone to England, there's not enough people to tax, right? So having tax powers isn't great. Let's talk finally then about nationalism. And for a side that stood for, we look to the future, we look to progress. Nationalism is a bit 19th century, right? What they want to say is, well, it's all about civic nationalism. It's about common political cultures and feelings. Yeah, that would define Britain, right? Because the working class person in Govan has far more in common with a working class person in Bradford than he has with a kid at Fettes or at Glen Almond College, who have things in common with those at Eton or at Harrow. After 300 years of a union, that is our identity now, and we're happy with it, thanks. Who are these mythical hardline Scottish us that the SNP and the second speaker keeps on talking about? Because they're not the people I grew up with, they're not the people I went to university with at St Andrews, they're not my friends, and they're not me. There's a parochial and there's a NIMBYing attitude to this kind of thing. And I think this comes out especially when they talk about nuclear weapons. There's been a real PR coup here where they've said the SNP wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. It doesn't. It wants to kick them 300 miles south of the border. And this matters to me because I'm a CND member and I have been for a long time. I want to get rid of nuclear weapons because I think they're bad. But I think they're bad because they kill people. And they still kill people if you launch them from Norfolk. If you genuinely... No, if you're seriously opposed to nuclear weapons, why give up the political clout you've got in Westminster? Why give up the fight that could actually get that done? This is not fighting to rid us of nuclear weapons. This is throwing in the towel, giving up, opting out of the fight, and saying, as long as it doesn't happen in my back garden, I don't care if it happens at all. That is not a principled stance. That is not opposition. That is not solidarity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wrap up now. I sympathise with a lot of what the nationalists think. I want the world to be more left-wing. I want more spending on education and healthcare. I want more green technology. I want to scrap Trident. I want all those things. But we're going to get those things not at all, or we're going to get them together. And I say we should get them together because we are better that way. I want to end with a poem from Robert Burns. And we've heard a lot about, from the SNP about brought and sold for English gold, Burns' famous line, which was an unfortunate side effect of unwisely speculating in Panama. But this is from, this is from a poem called The Dumfries Volunteers, written by Robert Burns. Oh, let us not, like snarling tykes, in wrangling be divided, be Britain still to Britain true, amongst ourselves united. For never, but by British hands, will British wrongs be righted. I oppose.
Thank you, Ben, and indeed to all the speakers for what was an absolutely cracking debate. Very briefly, the events that are coming up. Tomorrow evening, we have the EU Forum, so chap at the top, if you want to talk about further integration in the EU, come along here at 7 p.m. and you'll get it. 5 p.m. tomorrow evening, Saturday evening, we have Martti Ahtisaari, former president of Finland, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and architect of peace processes in Kosovo, Iraq, and Aceh in northern Indonesia, among others. A really fascinating man, well worth coming to. He'll be speaking on his life and work. Continuing with the diplomatic theme, on Monday, we'll be having he is an ambassador, but his official title is Minister Counselor from the Russian Embassy, coming to speak here in the chamber at 7 p.m. It should be an excellent and obviously hotly topical talk. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian ambassadors had to go back to Ukraine to quell violence along with the elections. I hope you'll forgive his absence. He's told us he'll be back in June, a variety of factors permitting. Beyond our regular weekly events, there's nothing more next week, other than Africa Day, which is all day on Friday, organized in collaboration with the Africa Society. On Saturday, David Hasselhoff will be coming. I don't think he needs much of an introduction. I think he's the only person who's excited me more than Katie Hopkins in every possible sense. On the 11th of June, we resume after exams with Kath Kidston coming to speak again on her life and work, and obviously fantastic designer and also one of Britain's most prominent businesswomen, before the presidential debate, the final debate of term, and my last as president, if only for the first 5 minutes, where I will be proposing the motion, this House believes that feminism should exclude men. It's not the first time feminists have told me to go away, but I suppose it's interesting that I'm doing it myself. And there'll be lots of fantastic speakers in that debate in addition to me. I'm not quite so fantastic, but it should be worth coming to nonetheless, so do come along. The final thing to say is that the door by which you leave is significant. Eyes to the right, nose to the left, abstentions down the middle. If you could just give a moment so the speakers from the debate could leave, because they often get crushed by the adoring throngs. I'm sure everyone will be greatly appreciative. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.